Hello, it's Saturday morning. My name's Garland Nixon. I'm here with the one and only, the writer, the author, one of the great minds of our time, Dan Lazare. Dan, welcome back to my YouTube channel, humble
Uh,
as it may be.
Thanks for having me.
Certainly appreciate you coming on here. We're going to talk about Ukraine. We're going to talk about foreign policy. We got a lot to discuss. Let's talk.
Sounds good.
Good morning, Dan. Plenty to talk about. I'll tell you one of the stories that I thought was of great consequence and very enlightening for those who didn't already know what you and I probably have understood a while back. Boris Johnson, apparently an article came out that Boris Johnson traveled to Ukraine, that at some point it appears that the Ukrainians may have been working at, I will interpret what I've read to say they had been working towards some manner of a deal with the Russians. Whether how valid that was, I don't know, but they had been working towards some kind of a deal. Boris Johnson apparently went there and said, Putin can't be dealt with. He must be defeated, and drop any thoughts or hopes you had of a deal and keep up the fight. And we're going to continue pumping weapons into it. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean it's hard to know exactly what was said, but clearly the U.S. and the U.K. feel that that sending all this weaponry to the Ukraine is conditional upon the Ukraine not giving in quickly, not reaching a quick settlement with Russia. Sort of fighting, putting up a stiff fight aimed at beating Russia back, humiliating Russia, reducing Russia, crippling it, to quote Secretary of Defense Austin. So essentially, all those weapons come with a quid pro quo, and that is that the Ukraine has got to follow NATO policy, which NATO wants the Ukraine to be sort of like the vanguard in the anti-Russian struggle. It wants the Ukraine to use all that weaponry to expel Russia from the entirety of the country, and to humiliate it and defeat it and essentially eliminate Putin as a major player in world politics. So the U.S. doesn't want to do it itself for a variety of reasons, but it feels safer if the Ukraine does it. So that's part of the bargain. The bargain is the Ukraine supplies the bodies, and the U.S. and U.K., et cetera, provide the material.
Well, I've watched, I think it's important to read all sides here, right? And I've read everything from the Washington Post, the New York Times, of course, from lots of stuff from anonymous intelligence officials there, Jacob Dreisen report, Scott Ritter, and so in all of putting this all together, it appears to me that they're delusional if they think that somehow Ukraine's going to wake up one day, and defeat the Russian army. It doesn't seem like it's realistic. The more I see this kind of stuff, to me, I think the more it becomes obvious that Ukraine is like really a pawn that's being sacrificed. That, I mean, the more immoral it becomes. Oh, excuse, let me put it a different way. The more it becomes obvious how immoral it is to just say, I'm going to let this country get wiped out and destroyed in the hopes that they'll do something that all data now indicates there's about a 99.9% chance that they're not going to be able to do.
Well, there was a really interesting article in the Guardian yesterday. The Guardian put it up and then took it down just hours later. In Kiev, there was a demonstration by about 50 wives of Azov Battalion soldiers who were trapped in Mariupol. So the Azov Battalion is led by Nazis, that's clear. But no, the rank and file is a different question. I mean, even the German Wehrmacht in World War II, it was led by Nazis, but the rank and file included, ordinary soldiers. Some of them were communists, socialists, etc. They didn't have much choice but to go to follow orders, but the ranks themselves were diverse. So apparently, these wives of the soldiers in Mariupol staged a demonstration, an unauthorized demonstration, calling on the Kiev government to enter into negotiations with the Russians in order to extricate their husbands from Mariupol. The police closed down the demonstration very rapidly, and in fact, they gave conscription notices, induction notices to the scattering of men who also took part in the protest, and that was it. But apparently, what that suggests is that some portion of the Ukrainian population is not happy with this US slash Azov strategy of fighting the Russians to the last Ukrainian. And not all Ukrainians want to be sacrificial lambs for this imperial policy. The Azov battalion apparently is, the Azov leadership apparently is, but the rank and file, the average military person, does not want to throw his life away needlessly, especially if the result will be a victorious America and a devastated Ukraine, which America, of course, will promise to rebuild at some unspecified future date, but that'll never happen.
Right.
So there are rumblings of discontent, and I think this is very, very important, because I think it shows, among other things, that the Zelensky government is really directed by the Azov hardliners, and the UN,
Right.
who the US is backing up.
Yeah, and that's the point here, that I think that when you say directed by the Azov hardliners, it's the US has, as they did with Al Qaeda and various jihadist groups in Syria and in Afghanistan and on. It seems to me this is the typical plan, which is go to a region, find the most outrageous, traitorous elements that you can get, and then arm and direct them against a sovereign government of some fashion. It hasn't worked out in the past. But the other part of it that I think is how much it destabilizes the region. It appears to me that we've been talking about what happens outside of Ukraine, but what you're saying, and I remember seeing a little bit of that story, is that at some point the people in Ukraine are going to wake up and say, where are all of our sons? They were all in Donbas and they were surrounded by the Russians and none of them are coming home. Where are our brothers? Where are our, our husbands? And at some point in time, the Ukrainian people are going to start feeling the pain and turning on their masters. It sounds like that's already begun.
I think that demonstration in Kiev about 24 hours ago suggests the possibility. We can't be sure what's happening. It's all too obscure. We don't have good information, but it suggests that some Ukrainians are unhappy with this U.S. Azov policy of fighting to the last Ukrainian, leaving the country absolutely devastated. And winning a victory for the U.S., but not for their own country. So that's the way it seems. And by the way, you're right. During the Afghan war in the 80s, U.S. aid, the bulk of U.S. aid flowed to a bunch of mujahideen led by a guy named Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. And he was the worst, the most reactionary, the most vicious, the most sadistic of the various mujahideen groups, but he was also the best fighter. So the U.S. wound up empowering him, and he ended up doing the U.S.'s bidding, with the result of that Afghanistan was completely destroyed, so destroyed that the Afghans themselves were happy to welcome in the Taliban in 1996, because the Taliban at least provided for a degree of law and order, and that's it. And the same thing happened in Syria after 2011. Where substantial amounts of U.S. aid also wound up flowing to Al-Qaeda controlled groups and even to ISIS. Even though the U.S. had no relations with ISIS, large quantities of U.S. aid wound up in ISIS's hands. And this is according to a study by a EU-funded group in London, the Committee on Armaments Research, which found that vast amounts of Saudi and U.S. aid, Saudi and U.S. purchased weaponry, were finding their way into the hands of ISIS. And it's simply that ISIS was the best fight. The ISIS members were the best fighters against the Assad regime, and therefore somehow America saw to it that they got the best weaponry. And that's the way these things work. And now it's happening with the Azov Battalion.
You know, Dan, I think I have an advantage of doing a lot of different radio. You know, I do, of course, Sputnik Radio, but I have a Pacifica show in WPFW in Washington, D.C., and also KPFK in Los Angeles. And when the wars first started, you know, I'm pretty solid on my position. And, you know, I've reviewed the history of NATO, and, you know, I'm never, as far as I'm concerned, Boris Johnson said this is a war between good and evil. And when I see Nazis, I'm never going to consider that's the good side, right? Early, I was getting, you know, the calls that said, literally somebody said you're a Putin stooge and things of that nature. The calls have taken a marked turn. Whereas people say, thank you, I agree with you. Keep doing what you're doing. Keep standing up. I believe, and let me add this, and I get so many callers now who are familiar, particularly with the Azov Battalion and the Nazis, and have a problem with that. You and I talked about this earlier, and I believed all along that they're creating a moral dilemma for many people, wherein people are saying, well, I'm supposed to hate Putin and I'm supposed to support the Democrats or US or whatever, but holy crap, these people are goose-stepping, Sieg Heil, swastika tattooed Nazis. They're not neo-Nazis. Neo implies new. They trace their legacy to the real deal. Your thoughts on, am I wrong?
No,
how do you see this playing out in the long term?
This is very, very important. This is a big scandal. I mean, essentially, the Azov Battalion, you know, before the war, people were putting out reports that the Azov Battalion only numbered somewhere between 900 and 2,000 people. And that of those people, only 20% were hardcore Nazis. So therefore, we were talking with a few hundred, you know, bad apples. But it's clear that under the conditions of war, that the Azov Battalion's numbers have exploded. According to Andrei Beletsky, the founder of the Azov Battalion back in 2014, there are now scores and scores, quote unquote, of thousands of Azov fighters in the front lines in the Ukraine. So that is a huge presence. And these people are Nazis. I mean, this is they trace their origins back to Stepan Bandera, the World War II collaborationist leader, who was who killed thousands of Jews, up to 100,000 Poles in a ethnic cleansing operation that that his forces mounted in August 1943. He was a Nazi, and dozens of Ukrainian cities have put up statues or plaques in his honor. Libraries have, host discussions on his teachings, his ideas. Streets are named for him in any number of Ukrainian cities. Ukrainian postage stamps bear his image. Now, this is a scandal. This is an absolute scandal. What are we doing? What is the U.S. doing fighting for a state that celebrates a Hitlerite? And this obvious nonsense that it's all somehow Russian propaganda. It is just obvious nonsense, and that message is getting through. I think that's why people who call you up are changing their tune. They're beginning to realize that how problematic the Ukrainian state is, and they're drawing back. They don't know how to respond. There was the supporters of the Azov Battalion just vandalized a few days ago a British military cemetery in the Netherlands. the cemetery contains the bodies, I believe, of 1,600 British, Australian, Canadian troops who died fighting Nazism. And their reward is to have their graves defaced, to have, their, pro-Azov slogans spray painted on the entrance to the cemetery. Where is the outrage? I mean, when Ronald Reagan paid a visit to a cemetery in Bitburg, Germany, containing the graves of SS officers, there was a vast outcry, and Reagan was forced to back down. But but here we have, pro-Azov elements defacing the graves of very brave men who made the ultimate sacrifice in the war against Nazism. They have defaced the Soviet War Memorial at Treptow, Berlin. I've been to that memorial. It's a very impressive, very moving structure. It stretches out over like about 2 acres. It's filled with these marble slabs showing, friezes, bas-reliefs of soldiers fighting. I think 16,000 Soviet soldiers are buried there, and who perished in the Battle of Berlin. I mean, we can't stand by and watch while these sacrifices, turn out for nothing while they are repudiated. We just can't tolerate that. I mean, does anybody care? I certainly do.
I mean, you and I both. I've been, and all of my journalism and all of the stations that I go on for months before this occurred. This has been a top priority for me. It's near and dear to my heart. I think that the other thing that you brought up, 2 things. We've got Victory Day coming up here on May 9th. And I think that there's going to be a big problem in Europe and even in the US as that's discussed, as that's remembered, because people like me are going to, on Victory Day, point to this. That's what I'm covering that day. May 9th, I'm covering this Nazi issue. How in the world, on the day that you defeated the Nazis, can we be back to where this time we're on the side of the Nazis? So I take that to, so let me ask you about this, about how the celebration of Victory Day on May 9th is going to maybe expose the contradiction even brighter, and the issue that you're talking about. Ukrainian refugees, some of them of the goose-stepping and sig-heiling culture, shall we say, are showing up all over Europe, and they're defacing things. They're doing the stuff that they would do in Ukraine in other places. How that's going to play out. And I've read report after report where, they're getting on the trains free. People are upset. People are taking them in their houses. They got a whole bunch of Ukrainians in their houses. They're not getting enough the money to feed them. It's turning into the Ukrainian refugee crisis is turning into a disaster. And B, some of them are of a highly dubious culture, and they're transporting that culture to some areas that may not be thrilled about it, politically and culturally. Your thoughts on all of that, Dan?
Yeah, I mean, we should emphasize that this does not apply to all Ukrainians. I mean, there's a very bad war going on. People are fleeing for their lives. Women and children are fleeing for safety, while the men stay behind and fight. So those people have my sympathy. I mean, when bombs start artillery shells start landing near your apartment block, you just have got to flee for safety. And you wind up in places like Warsaw, Poland, or Berlin.
And add this, and even some of the Ukrainian soldiers, a lot of them are just conscripts who don't want to fight, who are grabbed by a government and thrown out like cannon fodder.
Right. But just as the war in Afghanistan, or the U.S.-backed jihad in Syria, that those led to an explosion of jihadi terrorism that occurred all over the world. And this similar policy in the Ukraine is going to lead to an explosion of Nazism, violent Nazism, in the same way. So we're starting to see it already with graffiti and this kind of stuff. The Russian Journalism Outpost was apparently bombed in Berlin yesterday. So we're going to see more and more of this stuff. A violent ultra right is making a reappearance, and it's doing so, thanks to the Western aid that is flowing into the Ukraine and winding up in the hands of these elements. And by the way, I'm not making a pro-Putin argument. I mean, because there are ultra-right forces that are evident in Russia as well. I mean, that's all. It's not a case of it's no more a pro-Putin argument than arguing against the invasion of Iraq in 2003 was a pro-Saddam argument.
Right.
Okay. But nonetheless, it shows how duplicitous and hypocritical the U.S. stance is, because once again, it is putting arms in the hands of the absolutely worst elements. And the overall effect will be to make things much worse than they already are, and will lead to the rebirth of a violent ultra-right, throughout Europe and the U.S. as well. Remember, Brenton Tarrant, the guy who killed 49 Muslims in, I think, 2019, an attack in New Zealand, in the town of Christchurch.
Mm-hmm.
He went into battle wearing a jacket bearing the emblem of the Azov Battalion. We will see that more and more, the more these policies continue.
Well, the other thing too, Dan, is because of the economic calamity that the lunatics in Brussels and around Europe have brought upon themselves, you're bringing in a millions of people who, when this shakes out, and the British people who, I've read an article of a family who brought in 7 Ukrainians, and like they had 3 dogs or something, and they were getting 350 pounds a month. So this is not sustainable. You're going to have a huge class of people who don't want to go back to Ukraine. It was the poorest country in Europe, prior to the war, who are going to say, I don't want to go back. They're going to be poor. They're going to be desperate. We know, looking in the history of the cities in America with a lot of very poor Black people, what that creates. It creates crime. It creates desperation. It creates a lot of problems. So I think the other thing is, Dave, they're going to create a huge element of poor, desperate people who are going to be legitimately, a lot of them, angry, saying, you guys blew our country to hell, turned us into refugees. Now you don't want to take care of us. Now we're struggling. You're going to have a desperate class with crime, and you're going to have a bunch of Europeans who are angry, saying, yeah, and you know how this goes. Why are you spending the money on refugees when we can't afford food? You're creating a monstrous dynamic culturally and politically.
Yes, yeah. I mean, in 2014 and 15, this endless U.S. wars in Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, etc., led to a refugee crisis where hundreds of thousands of people made their way into Europe, and seeking refuge from the chaos that the U.S. is helping to create across the Middle East. And refugees are expensive. They're disruptive. You got to take care of them. You got to find jobs for them. You've got to integrate them into society, and there's often, the cultures often clash.
Language. A lot of them can't even speak the language.
So I wish the refugees best. I think that the governments, in question, should do whatever they can to help these refugees settle down, but they should tell the Americans to stop burdening us with these expenses by mounting crazy, endless wars in the Middle East. Because it isn't America that pays the price, it's Europe that pays the price. And those refugees, because that wasn't done, those refugees triggered wave after wave of xenophobia, whose effects are still being felt. Marine Le Pen lost to Emmanuel Macron. I forgot what the margin was, but but she lost by half the margin that she lost in 2017. In other words, she's closed the gap by 50%. And if these policies go on, she will close the gap even more, and France will tip into the fascist category. So these policies are radically unstabilizing, yet the US radically destabilizing, yet the US pursues them regardless. As the reasons why it pursues them, that's the question. The empire feels that it must patrol its boundaries, must beat back all rivals and any threats. Must maintain a war zone on its periphery, to sort of keep the barbarians out. Although the barbarians view the Americans as the real barbarians. But these are how imperial policies work. They create a cordon of fire on the edge of the empire, and now that cordon of fire is causing all of the Ukraine to burst into flames.
Yeah, and let me remind everyone, I am on Rockfin. I've been putting the links. I've been putting the links in the chat. So for those of you who can, I would certainly please appreciate it if you click on those links. I'm trying to get as many people as I can to move over to Rockfin, to check me out on Rockfin. And here's one of the big reasons: because we don't know how long any people who have an anti-war, who have an anti-imperialist stance, those who have an anti-capitalist stance, those who are pushing back against any of the mainstream narratives, we don't know how long we'll be here. So please click on, you'll see me in the chats. You'll see where I put the link into Rockfin. I'd appreciate, go over there, follow me at Rockfin. You can become a member, I think, for like $9.99, and you can see premium content. I don't have any premium content up. I will at some point. And for that $9.99, you can see premium content on any channel, not just mine. So it's worth it. But you don't have to do the $9.99. So click on the link, go to Rockfin, and everybody smash the like button. Dan, we're standing by for Caleb Maupin, but I do want to ask you this before we go. All of the things that we're talking creates an environment wherein, as I said, I do terrestrial radio in Los Angeles and Washington, D.C. I see and hear with my own ears the ground changing underneath the feet of the neocons. That's created an environment where they have to have this government censorship board. I think the narrative is in trouble. They're in trouble, and they know it. And the government censorship, we'll call it the censorship board that they've created with this crazy, scary Poppins woman, is a sign of desperation. And I don't think it's going to stem the tide, Dan.
Well, the Democrats are in big trouble. Big trouble. I mean, they're facing. I mean, unless every last poll is wrong, they are facing an epic wipeout in November. I mean, Joe Biden's popularity continues to sink. The economy is in big trouble, and Americans are very concerned and frightened about what's happening to their own economic prospects. So I expect that those feelings will make themselves felt on election day in November, and the Democrats won't be very happy. But the funny thing is, I mean, I'm old enough to remember the anti-Vietnam movement of the 1960s and early 70s, and that movement, in large measure, came out of the left wing of the Democratic Party. Gene McCarthy, for example, mounted a very powerful presidential bid in 1968, which essentially caused LBJ to withdraw from the race. But this time around, history will not repeat itself, because the Democrats in toto, including their left wing, including Bernie Sanders, including AOC, are committed to this war. So when the people revolt against this war, and they will revolt against the war because they cannot see sending $33 billion to neo-Nazis while their own conditions plunge. So when the working class revolts against this war, it will not have it will not have Democratic Party members as its leaders, which is a good thing.
I think you're right.
Because the Democrats, as far as I'm concerned, have turned into the war party, even more than the Republicans. So they must be overthrown, and I believe that the only solution lies in a socialist-led workers' anti-war movement, which I think will take shape as conditions continue to go downhill.
I think you're right, Dan, and I certainly appreciate it. Boy, that's the perfect segue for the next guy that we got coming in, Caleb Maupin. I love Caleb Maupin. Dan Lazare. Oh, by the way, Dan's got some books out. Dan, what are the books? What are your books?
I've written my books. I've written 3 books. The Frozen Republic, a critique of the U.S. Constitution, published by Harcourt Brace back in 1996. America's Undeclared War, a critique of American urban policy, published by Harcourt in 2001, and also The Velvet Coup, an analysis of George W. Bush's stolen election, was published also in 2001 by Verso.
So all right, thank you very much.
You can find those all on Amazon.
Awesome. Dan Lazare, thanks a lot. And he's a regular guest on my show in the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. Thanks a lot, Dan. Talk to you soon.
My pleasure.
All right. Well, that's awesome. Let me remind everyone that I am on Rockfin. And that on Rockfin, it's a great platform. And of course, as we know, there is a lot of Rockfin is ROKFIN. I'm going to do it again. Let me put it in the the comments. As you know, there's tremendous amount of censorship going on, and we must be prepared. Those of us who push against the mainstream narratives have to be prepared for any level of censorship, up to and including most of us getting tossed off of YouTube. And I want all of the people that follow me, in the event that we wake up one day and Garland's YouTube channel has gone the way of the dodo bird, I want you to know that you can go to rockfin.com, ROKFIN.com/Garland Nixon. Those of you who can, I would appreciate if you would click on the link and go there now and start doing Rockfin and get accustomed. All my shows, everything I do is going to be on Rockfin, and I'm going to do some exclusive things on Rockfin too. But the time is coming, I think, when we don't know when, how. I'm not leaving. I was going to leave, but I decided I'm going to make them throw me off. But I have a feeling they're going to do it. Now, man, we got an important guy who's doing some important work. The one and only, my dear friend and comrade, Caleb Maupin. Caleb, welcome to Saturday Morning Live.
Sure. Glad to be here. How you doing?
Wonderful, wonderful. So let's start here, Caleb. Let me ask you this before we get started. If I said to Caleb Maupin, well, let's start here. What tell people about your think tank, how they can find out about it, how they can be a part of it.
Sure. Well, we're the Center for Political Innovation, CPIUSA.org. We're advocating socialist policies to make the United States better, economic reforms, as well as an end to the wars around the world. You can check out what we're all about on the website. If you like what we're about, you can even join on the website. So there you go.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. All right, let's start here, Caleb. Before I start all of the things that I want to talk about, what is Caleb Maupin's, if you had to pick the big story of the week that you've been covering, what do you think is the big story of the week?
Well, I'd say the ongoing war and the food crisis that it's going to foment. I think that's the big story. And I've seen some about it. The Wall Street Journal has talked about it a little bit, and it's gotten some coverage, but people have no idea. The fact that fertilizer is not going to be delivered from Russia, the fact that that the harvest in Ukraine is going to be about 50% of what it usually is, the fact that Russia's wheat exports are not going to come. I mean, this is going to be big. People are not going to have the food they need. That's pretty huge. The latest also development that I think is particularly interesting is uranium. They're cutting off Russian gas. They're cutting off Russian oil. But there's another energy source that we really need that comes from Russia, and that's uranium. Our nuclear power plants, that's 20% of our power in the United States, a fifth, it comes from nuclear power. And nuclear power plants in the United States need uranium. And our main source of uranium is the state-controlled corporation in Russia, Rosatom. And Rosatom provides us with our uranium. So we now have the U.S. Energy Secretary coming out and saying that we're not going to get any more uranium from Russia, not explaining how we're going to do it, because yes, we do have some uranium here in the United States, but setting up domestic uranium supply, Like that's a process that takes years, not months. And that's a big deal. And the environmental impact is quite big. And Russia's got plenty of uranium to sell us. So what's going on there? I mean, is Biden talking about shutting down the nuclear power plants of the United States? We've already got skyrocketing prices of food. They're going to get higher. We got prices of gasoline through the roof and heating gas through the roof. And now it looks like our energy bills are about to go up because nuclear power in the United States may be shutting down because we can't get uranium from Russia. How much are the American leaders going to make us suffer in the name of hurting Russia and hurting the Putin government? How much are they going to make us suffer? I mean, it's just the costs just keep getting higher and higher every day for us. It's pretty ridiculous.
I think, one of the things, a couple of things that Dan and I were talking about was the disastrous results. And this is just follows on that theme, the disastrous results of the decisions of the leadership in Brussels, in London, in Paris, in the US. And I think that ties in to the censorship issue. You've been a victim of extreme censorship, but I think that ties in because I believe I do terrestrial radio and I hear the callers in DC and in Los Angeles. And it started off at the beginning of the war. You're a Putin stooge, a Russian bot, whatever, right? Those calls have changed. And almost every call, most of the shows I get, every call, when I stand up against imperialism, which I do, I stand up against Nazis, which I do every show, and I tell people why, and I give them the moral reasons for it. People are now saying, keep up the good work, Garland. They're saying, you're doing good work. They're saying, be careful. I'm sure they're watching you. I think the censorship shows the desperation that people are waking up to the reality that their scheme is contradictory, that their scheme is hurting the people that they are responsible to look out for. And this censorship is a pushback, and it really shows that they're in deep and serious trouble.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. I mean, when our teams have been out from the Center for Political Innovation, people from all walks of life are giving us positive feedback. College students, older libertarian guys walking around with their girlfriends, foreign students, small business owners. So many people are saying, yeah, we're tired of this. Yeah, we need to negotiate peace. I mean, the fact that it was revealed yesterday that Boris Johnson is basically trying to prevent peace negotiations, that's big. The fact that the Pope is taking a stance where he's basically saying this is, a lot of NATO to blame. A lot is changing pretty quickly. People are tired of this, but our war leaders in Washington are determined to keep it going. They want those high gas price profits, and they want to drive that price up. They want dominance on the global agricultural markets for American agribusiness corporations. So driving Russia off the markets, making countries have to import from the United States, creating a food crisis, that's in their interest. The weapons manufacturers are happy to make a killing, unloading all this military equipment onto Russia. It turns out a lot of it doesn't work. Have you heard about this?
Yes.
I mean, that's wild. They're unloading all this military equipment on Ukraine, and a lot of it, it doesn't even work. It's just, defective material. I mean, that's shocking. I'm sure you heard about that. I mean, there's a group of wealthy people that is making a killing off of this war, while the whole world economy is basically being set on fire, and working families are suffering around the world, food shortages, gas prices through the roof. I mean, it's not going to benefit anyone in the long term, except for this small clique of wealthy folks who see it as a great opportunity.
As reports come out that corporations are making the largest profits in 30 or 40 years right now, I believe that one of the things that's going to wake a lot of people up is Joe Biden's recent request. After last month, he asked for $13.6 billion for, quote, Ukraine. This month, another 33 billion. We're upwards of $50 billion in 2 months, as everyday people are not getting their needs met or are unable to feed their families. I think that's one of the things that's going to, unfortunately, but it's going to help wake people up to the reality that this government and this system is not on their side.
Yeah, and I mean it's already happening, and I think that at first it's going to probably benefit the Republicans the most. The kind of anti-establishment right, the Trumpian populist right, will be the main beneficiaries of it because they're the main force that seems to be somewhat critical of this. We've heard Donald Trump call this a European problem the USA shouldn't get involved in. And I think that they may be the main beneficiaries as we head toward the November elections, but their free market policies are not going to address the issue. I mean, ultimately, I agree with your previous guest. I mean, we're going to need some kind of working class socialist movement, but unfortunately, that's not, where the discourse is currently at. The left is so confused at this point, and then you got voices like Marjorie Taylor Greene and others that are somewhat critical, if not completely critical. A lot of them just want to fight China. If you
Right.
look at the people on the right, they say they don't want to focus on Russia, they want to focus on fighting China, and I think that's about finance, right? That if you're a big oil banker like ExxonMobil, the people who run the Ford Foundation, Russia is your main threat. Whereas if you're more of a manufacturer, if you're in the steel business or something like that, China is going to be the primary threat. So I think it's just kind of a difference of agenda there, between different financial interests. But at the end of the day, we're going to have American working families realize the problem. The problem is these big multinational corporations really don't care about us. They don't care about the economy of the United States. They don't care about the wages of working people. And we're gonna need a lot more people like Chris Smalls, the hero of the Amazon workers out on Staten Island, who organized his coworkers to stand up to Jeff Bezos, right? And we're gonna need a lot more of that, of people just kind of taking history into their hands and struggling and organizing. So yeah, I mean, that's what we're going to need if we're going to get out of this crisis. And it's going to take a while for people to learn it. It's not something people are just going to wake up one day and understand, right? Especially now that things have gotten so confused. So we're seeing that political development, but ultimately, I think things will eventually start to move in a good direction. There's that expression, it gets better, it gets worse before it gets better. And I think that's kind of what we're dealing with right now. This is the rock bottom. I mean, we've had the pandemic devastate the economy already. And now they won't let it end. They just want to keep the economic turmoil going because they're just so determined to protect the big monopolies, Jeff Bezos and Amazon and the Walton family and ExxonMobil. And it's like, how can we keep this fire going? How can we keep this economic crisis going just to make sure that the wealth centralizes in the hands of a few? It's pretty horrific to watch. It's pretty shocking.
Caleb, I think I agree with your point. And, I never really saw it that clear. But when we look at the fight between the Republicans and the Democrats, we look at the fight between those who are against Russia versus those who are against China. It's really just fights between factions of the ruling elite. That's all it is. The factions of the ruling elite are fighting, and they're using their puppets. They're using, whether it's Biden or Trump, they're using their masks of the illusion, and that's all we have in the United States now, is they're using the illusion of democracy via the Republicans or the Democrats to fight these fights between factions of the ruling elite.
Sure. Yeah. There's a great book called The Yankee and Cowboy War by Carl Oglesby. And he talks about the fight among the American elite and how you have this entrenched old money Eastern establishment of like New England liberals, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the DuPonts. And those folks tend to have a liberal perspective because they're so wealthy, they can get the government monopoly anyway. And they're more about stability. They want to keep society very stable and all of that. And they're the liberals. Whereas the conservatives are the more lower level entrepreneurial kind of capitalists, the new money, right? They got rich. Other people can get rich too. They want more of a libertarian hands-off policy because they feel like the game is rigged for those Eastern establishment old money interests, right? And that's the divide in American politics. The fracking companies, for example, are big supporters of conservatism and libertarian free market policies, whereas the big four super major oil companies, they want environmental regulations around the issue of climate change because they'll get to write them. They're rich enough, they'll get to write them. And that, they talk about big oil versus little oil, and these kind of divides, these kind of divisions. The Silicon Valley folks. Silicon Valley was basically created by the CIA and by the intelligence agencies, by the NSA. And that's a fact. It sounds all conspiratorial, but just Google it. I mean, it's just, the NSA and the CIA and the Pentagon, and they sat down and they said, the Soviets don't have as much resources to spend on the computer revolution in the 80s. We do. And they just started pouring money and loaning these people businesses and setting up, and Apple and IBM and all these corporations really just took off because of a strategic decision by the intelligence agencies and by the New England old money establishment. You got the Ford Foundation in there and others, and they said, we're going to make the information revolution. We're going to be the leaders of it. Al Gore he very famously said, I invented the internet, and everyone made fun of him for that. What he was referring to was that it was a U.S. government tactical decision to make, the computer revolution what they did. The market wasn't going to do that naturally. What's also interesting is that Al Gore's spiritual advisor, like the woman who gave him throughout his vice presidency and throughout his political career, who gave him spiritual guidance, was a woman named Marilyn Ferguson. And she was tied in with the Stanford Research Institute, which is one of the main places the CIA did their kind of academic research and their behavior studies and such. And Marilyn Ferguson, you read her Aquarian Conspiracy, this kind of manifesto she published in 1980. That's some intense stuff. I mean, these folks want a global revolution to overturn and destabilize and set everything back into balance with nature. And it's like, this is kind of the thinking of a lot of the intelligence apparatus, the California CIA that tends to be liberal. Those are the folks that brought us Project MK Ultra and such. Those folks tend to have a more liberal perspective, but it's not a socialist perspective. It's not a working families perspective. It's very much a very strange apocalyptic social engineering perspective, and that's who's guiding things. And that's where Silicon Valley comes out of. And you read about the Stanford Research Institute, you read about Marilyn Ferguson. Those are the people that have a lot of power, and they tend to be in with that liberal faction, whereas there's this kind of rebellion against them by the fracking companies and the lower levels of capital. There's a fight among our elite right now.
Well, and I look at it like, to me, what we have now is an ultra-liberalism, which is to me, ultra-liberalism is just the ultra-liberalism that we have now. In the same way that people say ultra-nationalism is fascism, it has become apparent that ultra-liberalism is a different strain of fascism. It's a fascism that says we're woke. It says, sure, we're going to overthrow countries. We're going to kill millions. We're going to make our people suffer and struggle, and we're going to give everything to the rich, but we're doing it for a good cause. We're doing it for the trans and the gay and the minorities and the underprivileged, and they come up with things like BIPOC, Black and Indigenous people of color. They come up with this kind of craziness, but it's to hide that really they're fascist, that they are people who, rather than, and here's what I say about the ultra liberals, rather than organize their society like a lot of traditional fascism has, around a single powerful, charismatic, authoritarian figure, they want to organize it around an ideology. And that ideology is supposed to be good. And so they don't have to say it's ethnic, we're the white Aryans and we're better, but they say we're the woke crowd. And that's the same effect. Your thoughts on that, Caleb?
Sure. Well, liberalism, when we talk about liberalism, a lot of people think in terms like liberals and conservatives, but the term liberalism, I mean, it comes out of the revolutions to bring down feudalism. It's a philosophy that emphasizes individual rights. And liberalism is essentially the worldview that puts the individual above all else, right? And, you talk about Democrats are social liberals, emphasizing things like gay marriage and abortion, that, your body, your choice, and you really have no obligation to society. Society has no obligation to you. That's like social liberalism. And then you have economic liberalism, which is emphasized by the Republicans, right? The free market, privatize it, everyone start their own business, government hands off, right? And that it's this philosophy that emphasizes the individual and opposes collectivism, right? That's generally what liberalism is defined as. And liberalism, it manifests itself with the right and with the left. The right tends to emphasize the market economic aspects of liberalism, whereas the left in the United States tends to emphasize the social aspects of liberalism. But it's a philosophy that says you're on your own. It's you against the world, right? It's the individual against the mob. And it's interesting. You can talk about, they talk about Ayn Rand and her writings that are used to promote the free market. But you can also talk about Friedrich Nietzsche, who's pushed really heavily on the left, who was the main source of inspiration for the Nazis. Also, yes. They drew their ideological heritage from him as well. This belief that there are men and supermen. There are some people that are just better than others, and the danger is that ordinary people will get together and make demands on them and force them to conform, and that's got to be stopped at all costs. And that there's a strand of philosophy that you can go talk about the neocons and Leo Strauss. And his elitist worldview, and that was a really big influence on like the Bush presidency and a lot of the people that were very big in U.S. foreign policy from like the Reagan years up until today. And this is a particular strand of thinking that is particularly dangerous, and it's ultra liberalism. That's a really good way of putting it. They are ultra individualists, the individual above all else. no group loyalty, no group identification. They're not communists. They're not loyal to their class. They're not, nationalists in the sense they're not loyal to their country or their nation or anything like that. They're loyal only to themselves, and they view the average people as dangerous and getting in the way of the great elite. It's very scary.
Yeah, I argue the only thing they're loyal to is their ideology, and their ideology is a fraud. They have to they can't tell people what it really, the neoliberal ideology has to be masked in some kind of a goodness they're working out, and they're creating an environment where you can prosper, when in reality, and this is the way I look at it. Well, here's what they're saying. There's an environment where you can prosper. And if you don't prosper, it's your own fault, because the environment is set to nurture prosperity for all. When in fact, it's completely rigged for the top 1%. In the same way, they have to create this illusion that we have democracy right now, when anyone, whether it's Bernie Sanders or Tulsi Gabbard or Nina Turner or anyone runs, whatever, regardless of what we think of those people, they view them as a threat to their way of doing things. So they have to constantly create an illusion of democracy, an illusion of a fair economic system, and really it's all rigged. And I think that's their game, and I think that's what's falling apart now, is the illusion. And that's why they need censorship, because they can't allow people to point out the obvious. Look at this thing. The billionaires are getting everything. It's rigged. You're being hoodwinked, bamboozled. And if that's anti-American, as Malcolm X said, we're just telling the truth. If the truth is anti-American, don't blame us, blame the truth. Caleb.
Sure. And these people, I mean, they have no real loyalty to the United States. They might hide behind patriotism and democratic ideals and all of that, but at the end of the day, they're wrecking the U.S. economy. They're making life worse for American working families, and they're letting the real predators who do prey on American working people get away. I mean, the people who got rich from the opioid epidemic, right? They were pushing doctors to overprescribe opioid medications. These big pharma guys were making out like bandits, while so many families, so many communities were devastated by addiction. You had that going on. You can talk about the prison industrial complex and how locking people in prison has turned into a way to make a lot of money for big corporations, and prison labor is basically a subsidy, right? Not only are they locking people in jail, and there's private prisons in a number of states, but on top of that, in even non-private prisons, you have prison labor, where these corporations, instead of hiring, law-abiding citizens on the outside who, to pay the minimum wage, you hire prisoners to take phone calls or manufacture products or whatnot, and you can make lots of money off of that. You don't have to pay them a minimum wage. They have absolutely no union rights or protections on the job. Prison labor is a big subsidy for these big corporations. You can talk about the fact that the infrastructure of the United States is crumbling, falling apart. I mean, our roads, our power plants are in shambles. Last year in Texas, you remember the power grid collapsed in the middle of the winter.
Yep.
I mean, that's where American working families are struggling. I mean, with the fact that, mass incarceration, the opioid epidemic, the crumbling infrastructure of communities, the wages going down. And I don't see them, if they're so patriotic, if they're so loyal to the American people and all that, why aren't they standing up? Why aren't they standing up for the American people against these, these billionaire monopolies that are just preying and just squeezing every last drop out of the American working families as the economy gets worse? Instead, they're having us fight Russia on the other side of the country. What has Russia ever done to us? I mean, what has Russia ever done to? It's pretty ridiculous when you look at it, and that they would hide behind some kind of patriotic narrative when, they really don't care about the people of the country. I'll tell you that much.
Let me ask you something, Caleb. As have I. You've traveled to South America. Here's my thoughts on Russia. It's about an alternative economic system. Here's what I mean. Until I went to South America and talked to the people, I didn't understand. People said, oh, they're a bunch of socialists or whatever. I didn't even back then understand socialism like I do now. But here's what I found out when I went there and talked to the people. In their various countries, they have lots of natural resources, wonderful natural resources, right? All kinds of lithium, you name it, they've got it, right? Gold, silver, everything. What the economic model that they like is they want their government to nationalize those resources, be it lithium, oil, whatever it is, to sell those on the world market. The government to have government companies and sell those on the world market, to take that money and I went there, and though the government takes that money and buys them free homes for the poor, gives money. I was in Venezuela. There was a cereal factory that Kellogg's or whoever it was left because of sanctions. The government then funded it, and the workers at the factory continued to work, ran and owned the factory, and created cereal for the people, which was really better off for them. But what they see is, and guess what? Very, very low taxes, if any, and free. The public transportation is free. Electricity, things of that nature are free. Okay. Russia is not a socialist country. It's a capitalist country. However, it has these giant Gazprom, Rosneft. What has Russia done? It has nationalized oil and gas and titanium and all of these natural resources, right? China has done that with industry. But what we find is countries, you may call one socialist, you can't call Russia a socialist country, but the model of nationalizing the natural resources, using the money, have that money come into the government so the government doesn't have to overly tax the people, and then using that money to build infrastructure and to subsidize businesses and things of that nature, that the U.S. Criminal vulture predatory capitalists see Russia as the same threat, because they're afraid that people here will say, well, wait a minute, they sell their oil and their gas and their gold and their palladium and titanium and neon gas, and they use that money to build infrastructure and to take care of the people. Why does Exxon Mobil and all of these countries get to do that with our stuff? I think that's one of the big reasons, if not the big reason, that they hate Russia, amongst others. Your thoughts?
Sure. I mean, in the 90s, when Soviet Union fell, Russia was just an impoverished country. It was economically falling apart, and BP was going in there and looting the place, and Hermitage Capital Management, and these companies were just going in there. They were buying factories and just closing them down, and something like 80% of the farms went bankrupt. In the 90s, things were not good in Russia. The way Putin fixed the economy was that he put oil and gas, this state-run oil company and the state-run gas company, Gazprom and Rosneft, he put them, as the centers of the economy, and started having the government start to have money once again by selling oil and gas on the international markets. And then that coincided with Bush's invasion of Iraq, which shot the oil prices very high. And so all of a sudden the Russian government had a lot of money, and then they used that money to rebuild the farming sector, rebuild the industries. And pretty soon, due to government revenue coming in, they had a strong economy once again, and they were producing. Their industrial output was about what it was at the time of the Soviet Union, before the Soviet Union fell. And they had kind of rebuilt their economy. And at that point, they weren't a country that was impoverished and just dependent on the United States. They were a competitor at that point. And that's what they don't like. They always tell us about how much they love the free market and competition. They don't want competitors. They don't like competitors selling oil and gas on the international markets. They also don't like China, Huawei, that makes better phones than Apple. They don't like that. They don't want that kind of competition. With any country, right? When these countries are impoverished and they're just dependent and they're importing U.S. products, the U.S. government is fine with it. But when they build up their own industries and they start exporting their own products and they raise their people up out of poverty, when they take natural resources into public ownership, all of a sudden they have an issue with it. And that's really what we need to understand. Imperialism is about keeping the world poor so that Wall Street and London can stay rich. That's how I've defined imperialism. Imperialism is not a policy. It's not, when you send troops to a country. It's a global economic system where, some big banks, the trusts, cartels, and syndicates, on Wall Street and London, when they enrich themselves by holding back economic development and keeping countries in poverty. When I was 12 years old, I went to Ecuador after, these neoliberal policies had been imposed on Ecuador. And what I saw was a humanitarian crisis, desperate, poor, starving people. I mean, during that time, I was 1999, I was 12 years old. I was seeing a humanitarian crisis where hundreds of thousands of people had been kicked off their farms, and poverty and all of this. I went back to Ecuador in 2013 after the socialist president Correa had been in there. Mm-hmm. It was a completely different country. They had rebuilt the infrastructure. People had housing. People had education. I mean, it was like I was like, was this the same country I visited when I was a kid? I mean, it was completely changed. Everything had been changed. They had named the streets after indigenous leaders. They'd given them names to honor the indigenous people. And it was like a country had lifted itself up. It wasn't the impoverished country full of desperate poverty that I saw when I was there, when I was 12 years old in 1999. By 2013, socialism and trade with China had just completely transformed the country. And I've been to Venezuela as well. I walked through a neighborhood in central Caracas where every single house was paid for with a government interest-free loan provided by the socialist leaders. You can talk about the housing missions they did there, how they've wiped out illiteracy. Illiteracy was a big plague, especially in like rural areas of Venezuela. And Chavez, he brought in those literacy volunteers from Cuba, and they wiped out illiteracy in the country. And they electrified the whole country. Venezuela, they sold a lot of oil, but when they were dominated by the imperialists, there were still a whole bunch of regions where people didn't have electricity or running water. Chavez got rid of that. He brought running water and electricity to the whole country. Yeah, they never give any information about all of this, right? They make it sound like everyone's just been poor and starving, but the achievements that were created in Venezuela by Chavez were quite dramatic and improving a lot of people's lives, and that's why they're still in power. There's a base of poor people who really, really benefited from socialism, and they are not gonna back down. And now the USA has made it very hard in Venezuela. They've imposed sanctions, made it hard for them to import food, etc. But there's a group of people that say, we will not go back. We are going to keep fighting for this because we remember how bad it was before, when we had to, light tires on fire and go on strike just to have the electricity come on in our neighborhoods. It's pretty amazing. And, you can call it socialism or 21st century socialism or anti-imperialism, but there is an alternative economic model taking place in the world, and it's emerging, and it's coming out of Russia, it's coming out of China, it's coming out of Iran, it's coming out of the Bolivarian countries of Latin America, where they're basically saying, we're not going to let the market have the power. We're going to have a government of action that controls the economy and ensures that economic growth continues. These people believe growth is good. Whereas the elite in the United States, you listen to Bill Gates, you listen to John Podesta, they think growth is bad. They think growth is the problem, right? There's just too many people in the world, and they're consuming too much, and they have too much stuff. They want to drive down the population. Whereas in China, they're saying, no, the problem isn't growth. The problem is it's unsustainable, right? And we need sustainable economic growth. We need to develop fusion energy and get off of fossil fuels. We need to develop, relationships with communities where they're using their own resources and such. And we need to change and adapt the way humanity interacts with its environment so we can do it in a long-term sustainable way. Then we can continue to have growth. The population can expand. Living standards can continue to rise. It's a very alternative worldview between the kind of degrowth Malthusian perspective of the ultra-rich versus the attitude that human beings, have reinvented their relationship with the environment many, many times, and we need to do it again, and we're going to do it with science and with innovation and breakthroughs.
Yeah, I want to remind everyone that in the comments, I put the link to Rockfin. As I've said many times, censorship is on the rise. I don't know, any given day, my YouTube channel could possibly be gone. So I want to make sure that everyone who follows me on YouTube also follows me on Rockfin. That's ROKFIN.com/Garland Nixon. And I'm continually putting the link in the comments. So please, if you can today, smash the like button, but also click there and go over and watch this thing on Rockfin. And please get used to watching me on Rockfin. Caleb, recently, something I want to bring up, Ukraine. Recently, Boris Johnson went to Ukraine and said, this is good versus evil, right? So let me show you who he was talking about. These are the evil guys right here. Cuba receives over 19,000 tons of wheat donated by Russia, right? And they go on to say the humanitarian cargo was sent to the island by the decision of the government of the Russian Federation. We continue in this way to help the Cuban people who face the COVID-19 pandemic, is forced to face the illegitimate and inhumane American blockade. This is from the bad guys. That's from the Russian. That's from the Russian ambassador to Cuba, right? But hey, the people are suffering. They need food. As you said, there's trouble with grain. Here's 19,000 tons free of charge. That's the bad guys. Let's look at the good guys, Caleb. Ukraine TV shows Nazi symbols on helmets of Ukraine soldiers. In a ZDF report on the fragile ceasefire in Ukraine, eastern Ukraine, this was 2014, Ukraine images were shown of soldiers wearing combat helmets with SS insignias and swastikas. According to Boris Johnson, the bad guys, they give away 19,000 tons of wheat to a country that the United States refuses to allow to choose their own manner. I don't care what anybody thinks about communism, socialism, capitalism, any of this. I believe in sovereignty. Every country should have a sovereign right to choose their economic path and their cultural and political path. That's number one. Here's the bad guys. Let me show you a picture of the good guys again. Friggin' Nazis, goose-stepping, sieg-heiling, Azov patch wearing Nazis. You know what? I do not agree with Boris Johnson that these are the good guys. Your thoughts on this dynamic, Caleb Maupin?
Sure. Well, every time you bring this up in American media, they just say that's Russian propaganda and all of that. These are facts. I mean, you know, you watch on Fox News, Zelensky was asked about, you know, the Azov Battalion, and he said, sure, yeah, we do have this Nazi division. They're real, and then moved on. It's like not a big deal. He actually brought one of them to the Greek parliament. When he was speaking to the Greek parliament, he actually brought an Azov Battalion Nazi with him. And the Greek people were outraged because they remember World War II. They remember what happened to their country. This Nazi problem the Ukrainians have, they want to downplay it. They want to just say, oh, that's Putin propaganda. No, I mean, this is a fact that they are tearing down World War II memorials. They are trying to rewrite the history of World War II to make Stepan Bandera, who was a Nazi collaborator, into a hero. These are facts, and you can't deny this. And that when Russia is fighting in Ukraine, they're fighting for the history of World War II, where the Soviet Union and the Americans were the good guys and the Nazis were the bad guys. And that is not what the majority of the ultra-nationalists that are backing Zelensky, that's not what they believe. And then they always say, well, Zelensky's Jewish. He's Jewish, so that disproves this. No, it doesn't disprove it. Because they've been marching against him and threatening him since the moment he was in office. They have their torchlit marches. They think he's a traitor, and they've been pressuring and demanding he be more hostile to Russia the whole time. On top of that, and also he doesn't really have the power. At the end of the day, I mean, these Azov Battalion guys in the military, and a lot of times they don't do what he wants. He came into office promising peace. He was going to de-escalate with the eastern regions. He was going to bring the conflict to an end. He's done the exact opposite of that because he doesn't really have the power. All this stuff about they're like Ukraine's independence, blah, blah, blah. Ukraine stopped being independent in 2014 when the USA toppled their government and installed a fanatically anti-Russian government in the Euromaidan coup. And that's when Ukraine stopped being independent. And now they're just basically using Ukraine as cannon fodder against Russia. They want Ukrainians to keep dying. Boris Johnson tried to stop and continues to try and stop peace negotiations. They just want to throw as many Ukrainian bodies at Russia as they possibly can, keep this going as long as they possibly can, so that big oil companies, natural gas companies, and weapons manufacturers can make a killing off of this. And it's horrifying. And they tell us they care about Ukraine, and it's all about they care so much about those poor Ukrainians. No, you don't. If you care about people, you wouldn't have had the CIA in their country for the past 5 years trying to figure out how to make their country a long-term battlefield. That's not what you do if you like somebody. You don't turn their homeland into a battlefield. You would want to negotiate peace. So it shows real hypocrisy on the part of leaders. And the censorship shows that, it's pretty blatant if you look into the facts, what's really going on here. And they want to shut it down. They want to silence people. They want to make sure that this viewpoint is not out there because the facts are really on our side. Russia does not seek a long-term intervention in Ukraine. They waited and they waited and they waited and they tried everything but this. And the USA forced the hand of the Ukrainian government. They did everything possible to force Russia into a situation where Russia feels like they have to intervene.
And I know you're busy, so one more question related to that, because I know it's important, and I know you supported the People's Republic of Donetsk and Lugansk, and that is one of the things. And don't forget, everybody, you can do super chats on here, and you can also do tips on Rockfin. So I would appreciate it. I got my website up, and I'm working on getting that better. I just got it started. I had little issues with it, but for those of us who could help get the website up, and don't forget, support me on Rockfin. Super chats here. I have a Patreon page, patreon.com/Garland Nixon. And you have a Patreon page, don't you? Also. Or do you, what do
I
you
I
have up?
am on Patreon. Yeah. Folks can support me on Patreon. I also have a YouTube channel where I regularly stream. I'm on Rockfin as well.
Oh,
And I always
wonderful.
tell my viewers, if I'm banned from YouTube, you know where to find me. I'll be on Rockfin. I stream on my Rockfin. So yeah. And we
Uh,
gotta get out there and free speech alternatives to the mainstream platforms. I am banned from PayPal. That's the ban that I got. Mint Press and myself and Consortium News, we all got banned. And there's been a lot of coverage of it because it just came out of nowhere. And for a while, they said we wouldn't even be getting access to our funds for at least 180 days. Now they did release our money that was waiting in the PayPal, but we're still no longer welcome to use PayPal, and that's an attack on free speech and censorship, most certainly. And my personal Twitter is labeled as Russian state-affiliated media. No one tells me at RT what to tweet. That's my personal Twitter. I mean, I'm not even verified or tied to a news agency. RT is not in my bio. It's my personal Twitter has been labeled Russian state-affiliated media, which shows it's basically an attempt to just say, don't listen to this guy. Don't listen to anything he says. It's pretty unbelievable. So the censorship we're seeing is pretty extreme. It's pretty shocking. I mean, banning people from YouTube, banning people from social media outlets. But we got to stand up against it.
The last question I want to ask you is, or get you to comment on, is about Ukraine. Here's what I find interesting. What we're told is this is a war between Russia and Ukraine, but that's not really true, because a large part of the ground fighting has been done by the People's Republic, the fighters and the militias of the People's Republic of Lugansk and Donetsk. A big part of this are Eastern Ukrainians who were attacked, who probably somewhere between 10 and 14,000 of them, Eastern Ukrainians, were killed by this Nazi regime over the last several years. So the argument that this is between Russia and Ukraine, to me, is a false argument, and they have to hide the fact that these are Eastern Ukrainians. A large part of the ground forces are Eastern Ukrainians who are fighting against a far right-wing fascist Nazi regime who tried to exterminate them. Your thoughts?
Sure. Well, at the UN Security Council meeting that happened on Thursday, the U.S. ambassador, the U.S. representative who was speaking, she said, Russia claims Ukraine bombed their own civilians. That's such an outrageous lie. It's a fact. The whole world, they've been bombing their own civilians for 8 years. They've been bombing their own civilians. And for her to just get up there and deny that before the whole world, I mean, and just say, oh, that's an outrageous lie. I mean, it's like, this is a fact. They have a memorial, for all the children. They have a special memorial for the children under 12 who were killed by this bombing. I mean, for 8 years, they've been bombing and killing civilians. The people of Donetsk, the people of Lugansk, they declared independence in 2014. And they asked Russia to recognize them as independent countries. And Russia said, no, we don't want to cause a problem in Ukraine. And they set up the Minsk agreements, the Minsk Accords. And the idea was that Ukraine would recognize their right to speak their Russian language, integrate them back into Ukrainian society. And for the past 8 years, the Ukrainian government has not implemented the Minsk agreement. They have done the opposite. They've been shelling and bombing these people. They've called them terrorists, etc. So finally, after 8 years, Russia is moving in to protect them. But yeah, a lot of the fighting is done by the people that are actually from these regions, from Donetsk, from Lugansk, that don't recognize the government in Kiev that was imposed by the United States. And they say, we're going to keep speaking Russian. We're going to keep our World War II monuments up. We're going to keep the statues of Lenin and the statues of Stalin up because that's our heritage. We're proud of our heritage in the Soviet Union. And we don't recognize this government in Kiev, and they have no interest in letting us speak our own language. One point I've made to people many times before is, could you imagine if some racist governor, some conservative racist governor in Texas or New Mexico said, you know what, we're going to start writing people tickets for speaking Spanish. There's Latinos in the United States, Chicanos, Latinos. If you're caught speaking Spanish, we're going to have the cops give you a ticket and we're going to drag you into court for speaking your own language. We would never stand for that here in the United States. We'd say that's racism. That's got to stop. That's exactly what the Ukrainian government has been doing to Russian-speaking people in their country for the past 8 years, giving them tickets, dragging them to court just for speaking their own language. That's pretty unbelievable. We wouldn't tolerate that in the United States. That's what the Ukrainian government has been doing to these people. And, 8 years 14,000 plus people dead, more like 16,000 if you include, the last couple years, et cetera. I mean, the 14,000, that statistic, it only includes up to a certain point, up to 2017, I believe. So it's more like 16,000 people killed by the shelling. At some point, Russia's got to say enough is enough. And again, they did everything to avoid this. They tried to facilitate the Minsk negotiations. They did everything they possibly could. And at the same time, these people have kept dying while they've been killing these people and implemented a food blockade. Then you have the government in Kiev threatening to get nuclear weapons, threatening to join NATO. And finally, Russia said, okay, enough is enough. We're going to move on in. Now they're moving on in and they want to get out of there. And, most Ukrainians want this to end. Most Ukrainians, I think, at this point are tired of this war. They may have different opinions about what's to cause, but I don't think they want their country to keep being a battlefield where people die. And now we know it's Western leaders that are determined to make Zelensky keep this going. Don't let him negotiate. And that's not good. That is not good for the Ukrainian people. It's not good for the world. It's good for the big corporations, for the ultra monopolies. That's what it's good for.
Well, keep up the good work, Caleb. Everyone, make sure you follow Caleb Maupin on Twitter. Make sure you follow Caleb's show on YouTube. It's a great show. He has a Patreon. I have a Patreon page. Caleb has a Patreon page. And what's the website again for your organization?
Oh, cpiusa.org. We're the Center for Political Innovation.
Yes, Caleb does fine work. He does a lot of late night chats. Pretty much most nights he's up with a chat and a lot of historic facts, a lot of historic details that you might not know about, a lot of great intellectual discussions. You can learn a lot by checking out Caleb. Thanks a lot, Caleb. Certainly appreciate you taking time out of your Saturday to come on.
Sure thing. It was a pleasure and have a lovely day.
Talk to you soon. There you go, my friend Caleb Maupin. He's a good guy, isn't he? Caleb's a good guy. He's a brilliant guy. Don't forget, everyone, let me put the Rockfin. Everyone, first of all, smash the like button. Secondly, you look on in the chats and you will see the Rockfin stream, the Rockfin link. Go to my Rockfin page, please. We've got 249 people. So I'm expecting that 249 people will go over to my Rockfin page and that they will all you can click. Rockfin is like this. So let me explain it. If you want to become a member, it's $9.99. $9.99 allows you to see premium content, but not just premium content for the ones for mine, for any of them. But you don't have to do the $9.99 if you can't afford it. I understand. You can still come on. You can still subscribe, follow my page, and I don't even have any premium content up yet. I eventually will have some, but I want everyone to subscribe. And I want everybody to be a member of my Rockfin page. That's Rockfin, ROKFIN.com/Garland Nixon. I want everybody over there. And I've got some great things coming up where I got some, I'm going to do some things on Rockfin. I couldn't cover COVID. There's a number of things you just can't do on YouTube that I'm going to be able to do on Rockfin. And I think you all will really enjoy it and will really like the opportunity to have discussions there. We've got a chat there and everything else. So there'll be an opportunity to have discussions there that we can't necessarily have here. So some of the things I'm going to do in the future are going to start on here, start on both. And at some point, I'm going to have to cut over to Rockfin and, have the discussions there that you can't have here. That'll get you tossed off. So I might hear from Scary Poppins over there at the government disinformation board or disinformation governance board. We don't want Scary Poppins to shut us off. So thanks, everyone. I certainly appreciate it. I do have Patreon, patreon.com/Garland Nixon. You can become a patron there. You can do super chats. You can do tips on Rockfin, all of that stuff to contribute towards my web page. I just paid like $250, $300 the other day towards my webpage and all that kind of stuff. And I'm happy to say that money came off Patreon and tips and all that stuff, that the people here that support me actually did all of that. I'm planning on building a network. I'm planning on doing some good stuff, and we're definitely going to do it, you and I. Thanks a lot. And talk to you all soon. Thanks a lot to Chicken Patty. Chicken Patty and I, we're tight. We go way back. And Coop W, Camilla V, all the many people who are here all the time supporting it and having a lot of fun together. I think that's the thing. I think we have a lot of fun together. I'm looking into a way that I can like take callers. Apparently there's an app now that you can take callers. I'm looking at at getting this thing called a Rodecaster Pro. That is a mixer that you can connect to your system where you can take callers, because that's something I want to do. I want to set up where I can do shows, and I have people that are either calling in by phone, calling in by app, and we can like get those kind of questions, and I can really interact with the audience members. I think that's going to be a blast. All right, thanks a lot. Don't forget rockfin.com. Go over there, please. Everybody here, smash the like button. Everybody here, go to Rockfin and become a member. Rockfin.com/Garland Nixon, or at least subscribe. As I said, if you can't afford it right now, that's fine. For those of you who can, I appreciate it. For those of you who can't, enjoy it, become a part of it. I know people are struggling. Peace. I'm out.